The sun was already up when I realized he wasn't coming home. The coffee on the counter cold, my birthday candles still unlit and leaning to one side like they'd given up waiting. The apartment was too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears until your own breathing sounds loud and unfamiliar. I sat there in yesterday's clothes, watching light crawl across the floor, knowing something had shifted and there was no way to put it back. If you've ever trusted someone who made you doubt your own instincts, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Stories like this don't start with shouting. They start with silence. I remember thinking I should feel angry, but what I felt instead was clarity, sharp and unwelcome. My phone stayed dark. The clock moved forward without asking me how I felt about it. That morning didn't explode my life. It quietly cracked it open. And I had no idea then how far that single night would unravel everything I thought I knew. I was still awake when the sky began to lighten, the pale blue creeping through the blinds like it had no idea what kind of night it was following. My coffee sat untouched on the table, cold enough to taste bitter just by looking at it. The small cake I had bought myself waited on the counter, candles still in their box. My birthday already over without a single wish made. I had spent the entire night listening to the apartment breathe, every tick of the clock reminding me that he was not where he said he would be. By the time the door finally opened, it was just after sunrise. The sound of his keys landing on the table was casual, familiar, almost insulting in its normalcy. He moved through the room without urgency, without the weight I was carrying in my chest. What struck me most was not that he looked tired, but that he did not look guilty. There was no scramble to explain, no fear of being caught, only the quiet confidence of someone who assumed this moment would pass. I sat there realizing something had already shifted. That was when I knew it had ended. I used to be the kind of woman people noticed without trying. I laughed easily, spoke up when something felt wrong, and never apologized for taking up space. Before my marriage, my voice felt natural to me, like breathing. That change did not happen all at once. It arrived quietly, disguised as maturity. I told myself that choosing calm over conflict meant I was growing. The first time I stayed silent because he looked tired, it felt reasonable. The first time I convinced myself that my discomfort was me being too sensitive, it felt responsible. Over time, those moments stacked on top of each other. I learned how to read his moods before speaking. I learned which thoughts were safer to keep to myself. I became skilled at smoothing over tension, at shrinking just enough so things would feel easier between us. I did not see it as loss back then. I saw it as compromise. I believed that love meant flexibility, that understanding meant swallowing the parts of myself that caused friction. Peace became more important than honesty, and quiet felt easier than asking questions that might change everything. Looking back, I can see how careful I became, how small my world grew. What I called growth was really disappearance. I was not becoming a better version of myself. I was slowly learning how to fade, long before I ever understood who else had room to stay. And in that quiet fading, there were spaces I did not notice at first, spaces that should have belonged to me, spaces that would eventually be filled by someone else, long before I had the courage to ask why at all then. I learned her name early, almost casually, folded into a story about the past that was supposed to be harmless. She was someone he had loved once, someone he insisted no longer mattered. I told myself that grown people could stay friends, that trust was the foundation I wanted to stand on. I wanted to be the kind of woman who did not flinch at old histories. So when her name came up again, and then again, I stayed calm. I smiled when he mentioned messages and coffee plans. I convinced myself that discomfort was insecurity, and insecurity was something I should outgrow. There were small moments that unsettled me. His phone lighting up late at night, tilted just enough that I could not see the screen. The way conversations softened or stopped when I entered the room. Laughs that did not need explaining. Apparently, none of it felt dramatic enough to confront. Once, I found a single earring in his car. It was not mine. I remember holding it in my palm and choosing the explanation that asked the least of me. Trust, I told myself, meant believing even when doubt whispered otherwise. Looking back, I can see how deliberate that choice was. Trust became a way of looking away. I did not question the space she occupied because questioning it would have required me to admit how much space I had already given up. She was never gone. She was simply patient, waiting in the background, long before my birthday showed me what that patience had cost me. I did not want anything big for my birthday. I told myself that early, like a promise meant to keep disappointment manageable. Dinner at home, a small cake from the bakery down the street, the comfort of being seen by the person who had promised to choose me every day. That felt like enough. I set the cake on the counter and left the candles in their box. I kept the lights low, the apartment quiet, the evening open. He said he would be home early. I believed him, the way I always did. As the hours moved forward, I filled the silence with explanations before he ever needed to offer them. By 8, I told myself traffic was bad. By 9, I assumed a work issue had come up. I scrolled through my phone, checking messages that never arrived, reminding myself not to overreact. Waiting had become something I was good at. 10 o'clock passed, then 11. Each unanswered call tightened something in my chest I had spent years ignoring. I sat at the table watching the clock, the cake untouched, the wish still unmade. Midnight arrived quietly. No call, no apology, just the soft click of a new day beginning without me. That was when it landed, not with drama, but with certainty. This was not forgetfulness. This was absence. My birthday ended the same way so many moments had, unseen and unheld. By the time morning came, I already knew the explanation would ask me to make room for his comfort again. I sat with that knowing, steady and cold, waiting for daylight to bring him home and explain away the night. I did not argue in my head anymore. I simply waited, aware that something fragile had finally hardened. It would never soften again after that. He came home after sunrise, moving through the kitchen like it was any other morning. His voice was calm, almost gentle, as if calm could erase absence. I noticed how relaxed his shoulders were, how unbothered he seemed by the hours I had spent awake. There was no urgency in him, no sense that anything had gone wrong. I listened while he framed the night as reasonable, unavoidable, something I should understand. What struck me was not the explanation itself, but the ease with which it was delivered. He sounded practiced. He sounded confident that his version would land softly enough for me to carry. I felt tired in a way sleep could not fix, not frantic, not angry, just clear. I realized I was being asked to absorb the discomfort again, to smooth it over so the morning could continue without friction. That was when I understood the difference between accountability and performance. My hands moved before my thoughts did. I looked down at the ring I had worn every day without question. Sliding it off felt quieter than I expected. No trembling, no ceremony. Just a small, final sound as it touched the table. Something steadied inside me then. The hurt did not vanish, but it stopped leading. I was no longer listening for reassurance. I was listening to myself. As he continued speaking, I knew I would not manage this moment for him. Whatever came next would be mine to face, and I was finally ready to see the truth waiting just beyond his calm demeanor alone. I stood alone in the quiet apartment, knowing I was about to cross a line I had defended for years. Trust had been my rule, not my feeling, something I followed even when it hurt. I told myself that looking would mean I had already lost. Not looking, I realized, meant I was willing to disappear again. The laptop sat open on the desk, screen dimmed but awake, like it had been waiting. My hands hovered, my chest tight. Every instinct split between loyalty and self-preservation. I wasn't searching for drama. I was searching for clarity. At first, everything looked ordinary. Work folders, emails, familiar routines that almost pulled me back. Then I noticed the names. Casual labels that didn't match the tone inside them. Messages filed as jokes that read like intimacy. Check-ins that carried a rhythm I recognized too well. My body reacted before my mind caught up. My breath shortened. My hands went cold. I wasn't angry yet. I was precise. I read slowly, absorbing patterns instead of lines, noticing how long this had been happening, how carefully it had been hidden. What I found wasn't confusion or temptation, it was continuity, planning, comfort, the ease of something practiced and protected. This wasn't a mistake from one night. It was a parallel life folded neatly beside ours. When I closed the laptop, the room felt different, sharper, stripped of illusion. I understood then that this wasn't suspicion anymore. It was truth. And once truth arrives, it doesn't ask permission to stay. There was no way back to not knowing, only a quiet path forward that I would soon take. I felt strangely calm, already detaching from the marriage I had been trying to save. Knowing departure was no longer dramatic, only necessary, deliberate, and finally mine alone. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask for explanations or apologies. I already had the truth, and I knew that speaking it aloud inside that apartment would only invite noise where clarity finally existed. I packed slowly, a few clothes, my documents, the things that still felt like mine. The rooms were quiet in a way I had never noticed before, almost unfamiliar, as if the space already knew I was leaving. Even the air felt different, carrying a faint scent that no longer belonged to me. I chose silence because I didn't need to be believed. I needed to be intact. I had spent too many years explaining myself, smoothing moments, making pain palatable. Walking away without an argument was the first decision I made purely for my own protection. I closed the door gently. I didn't look back. Not because it didn't matter, but because looking back would have meant reopening something I had already finished. The hotel room was small and plain, wrapped in a quiet that felt earned. The noise stayed behind in that apartment. The stories, the questions, the performance all remained there. What followed me instead was stillness, relief, and the steady understanding that I had left not in anger, but in truth. It felt like the first breath I had taken alone ever. I drove to my sister's house without rehearsing what I would say. The familiar street felt steadier than I did, but it held me. When I stepped inside, I carried years of silence in my chest. I told her everything. Not the softened version, not the careful one. I spoke without protecting him, without explaining away what hurt. Each sentence felt heavier and lighter at the same time, like setting something down after carrying it too far. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush to fix anything. She just stayed with me, listening in the quiet way that tells you someone believes you. When my voice cracked, I let it. The tears came slowly, almost politely, and I didn't wipe them away. What surprised me most was the absence of advice. No instructions, no timelines, just presence. I realized how rare it was to be supported without being managed. Sitting there, I felt something settle inside me. The truth no longer echoed back at me alone. It existed between us, solid and shared. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the story by myself. I was still grieving, still uncertain, but I was no longer isolated inside it. That realization gave me a quiet strength, one I would need when he finally noticed I was gone and learned my voice mattered. He reached out after the silence stretched long enough to scare him. The messages were careful, remorse shaped to sound familiar. He spoke about mistakes, about stress, about not wanting to lose what we had. His gestures were the same ones that once softened me, the tone designed to feel safe. For a moment, memory tugged at me. Years of shared routines, inside jokes, the comfort of knowing someone's habits. I felt the pull of who we used to be, and I let myself acknowledge it without shame. But I also noticed the timing. The apologies arrived only after the truth was undeniable, after I had stepped outside his control. They came wrapped in explanations that made the betrayal sound accidental, like weakness or confusion instead of choice. I heard how responsibility slid sideways, never fully landing where it belonged. Something stayed quiet inside me as he spoke. I wasn't angry. I wasn't persuadable. I understood then that nothing he was offering was new. It was simply late. I realized I wasn't deciding whether to forgive him. I was deciding whether to abandon myself again. That clarity settled everything. When I imagined my future, it no longer included waiting for him to change. It included peace, structure, and dignity. Choosing divorce felt less like an ending and more like alignment. I didn't need another conversation. I needed a plan, and I was finally ready to move forward. The next steps would be practical, deliberate, and mine alone, shaped by intention rather than emotion, marking the true beginning of recovery ahead. I met with an attorney on a quiet weekday afternoon, expecting to feel exposed or dramatic. Instead, the room felt orderly. Papers on the desk, questions asked without judgment. For the first time in weeks, my story was translated into facts. I noticed how different it felt to speak plainly. Dates, accounts, decisions. No one asked me how I felt about his choices. They asked what existed, what was shared, and what protections were reasonable. That shift grounded me. Emotion hadn't kept me safe. Structure might. As we reviewed documents, I realized how much I had assumed instead of verified. I had trusted that money was handled fairly because I wanted harmony. Seeing numbers written out showed gaps I hadn't questioned and responsibilities I had quietly carried alone. It wasn't shocking. It was clarifying. I understood then that preparing wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of respect for myself and for the life I needed to rebuild. Clarity wasn't cruelty. It was accountability, the same thing I had been asking for all along. Walking out of that office, I felt steadier than I had in months, not lighter, but anchored. I wasn't reacting to his choices anymore. I was responding to reality with intention. That mindset followed me home. I began gathering records, organizing statements, and paying attention to patterns I had once ignored. The grief was still there, but it no longer led. I was preparing now, and preparation brought a quiet confidence as I started tracing where everything had really been going. That awareness marked the moment I fully stepped into ownership of my future, ready to follow the money next without fear or hesitation. I started with the joint account because it felt safest, almost boring. I told myself I was just checking balances, confirming nothing was wrong. The first entries looked ordinary. Groceries, gas, small charges that matched our routines. It would have been easy to stop there and tell myself I had imagined the rest. But once I kept going, patterns emerged. Transfers spaced just far enough apart to avoid notice. Withdrawals that didn't match any shared expense, amounts small on their own, but persistent. Each line told the same quiet story of intention. I began lining up dates. A dinner he said ran late, a weekend he claimed was work travel. The numbers sat there without emotion, matching moments I already knew too well. Doubt didn't survive contact with consistency. One charge landed heavier than the rest. A boutique hotel, paid from our account, on a night I was alone with a candle waiting to be blown out. Seeing that entry stripped the memory of its confusion. The silence had been funded. I opened a spreadsheet and started organizing everything. Dates, totals, notes. What felt obsessive at first quickly became stabilizing. This wasn't about catching him. It was about understanding the scope of what had been taken without my consent. As the picture filled in, anger softened into something cleaner. Purpose. Evidence has a way of calming the body. It replaces spirals with steps and questions with answers. By the time I finished, I wasn't shaking. I was steady. The story no longer belonged to him. It was documented, dated, and impossible to explain away. I knew then that when he realized I could see the full picture, he would try to control the story next. I prepared myself quietly. Knowing truth often provokes resistance before accountability finally follows, appears publicly. He stopped apologizing once he realized tears no longer worked. What followed was quieter, but sharper. Stories began traveling ahead of me, softened versions that painted him as confused and me as unstable. Family members reached out with concern that felt rehearsed. Friends asked questions shaped by things I had never said. I felt the old reflex rise, the urge to protect him from judgment, to explain his behavior before anyone could misunderstand. That instinct had kept me silent for years. This time, I noticed it and let it pass. The escalation came when my work was pulled into it. Subtle inquiries, awkward pauses, a suggestion that my focus had slipped. He was trying to create doubt where facts already existed, hoping pressure would bend me back into compliance. Instead, I stayed calm. When asked, I told the same simple truth, without embellishment or defense. I shared only what was necessary and nothing more. Consistency became my shield. Each attempt to distort the story clarified something for everyone watching. His urgency contrasted with my steadiness. His explanations shifted. Mine did not. I realized that I was no longer managing his reputation. I was protecting my reality. The more he pushed, the stronger my footing became. What he meant as retaliation was documenting itself, building a trail no performance could erase. I sat at the table with my hands folded, noticing how quiet the room felt despite the movement around us. The courtroom was smaller than I imagined. Plain wood, neutral walls, no drama built into the space, just facts waiting to be heard. I felt steady. Not numb, not vindictive. Steady. Across from me, my husband shifted in his seat, energy restless, eyes searching for something to anchor him. I didn't look away, but I didn't look at him either. My focus stayed on the process. The evidence moved forward methodically. Bank statements aligned with dates, messages matched timelines, patterns emerged without commentary. Each document spoke clearly, without emotion, without interpretation. What once lived only inside my body now existed on paper. As the record filled in, the room grew still. There was nothing left to argue against. Intent showed itself through repetition. Silence did the rest. When the ruling came, it was delivered plainly. Assets accounted for. Responsibility assigned. Consequences acknowledged. I listened without reaction, absorbing each sentence as information, not victory. I didn't feel relief the way people describe it. What I felt was alignment. My inner truth and the public record finally matched. The story no longer belonged to memory or debate. I gathered my things slowly and stood. This wasn't an ending fueled by anger. It was a conclusion shaped by clarity. As I walked out, I understood something important. Justice didn't give me my old life back. It gave me permission to move forward without carrying what was never mine to hold. I breathed evenly, knowing the hardest work was finished, and the quiet rebuilding of myself could finally begin without fear or explanation again. I expected some rush after the ruling, some moment of satisfaction, but it never came. What followed was quieter than that. Slowly, his world began to thin. Friends stopped calling. Invitations faded. The version of him that depended on secrecy couldn't survive daylight, and it didn't try to. The other woman disappeared almost immediately, without lies to protect. There was nothing holding her there. That wasn't a victory to me. It was simply consequence doing its quiet work. What surprised me most was my own reaction. I didn't feel joy watching his life unravel. I felt distance. The anger I thought I would carry just loosened its grip and fell away. There was no urge to explain, correct, or prove anything anymore. Each day felt lighter. Not happier in a dramatic sense, just freer. My body moved without tension. My thoughts stopped circling the past. I slept without rehearsing conversations that would never happen. Justice, I learned, doesn't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrives as peace. Accountability doesn't need bitterness to be complete. It only needs truth and time. As that settled in, I understood I was finally done carrying his choices. That freedom felt steady and entirely mine. I moved into a space that was fully mine, and for the first time in years, nothing in it felt provisional. The furniture stayed where I put it. The lights were dim or bright because I chose them. Silence felt welcoming, not tense. I started with small changes. I cleared closets without negotiating. I cooked meals I actually wanted and ate them slowly. I woke up without checking my phone or bracing for someone else's mood. Energy returned in quiet ways, the kind you notice only after it has been missing. Friends came back into my life without effort, not to fix me, just to sit with me. Coffee turned into walks, walks into laughter. I stopped explaining myself. I didn't need witnesses anymore. One afternoon, I pulled out my old camera, the one I had packed away years earlier. I started taking photos again, not to share, just to see. Light through windows, empty streets, ordinary beauty. It reminded me how observant I used to be. Nothing about this phase felt dramatic. It felt earned. Day by day, I became recognizable to myself again, not who I was before, and not someone new, just me, steady and present. That was enough. For the first time in a long while, my life felt like it belonged to me, and I was finally home inside it, quietly rebuilding without fear now. I used to think strength looked like endurance, staying quiet, carrying weight without complaint. What I learned is that real strength is listening to yourself when something feels wrong, and honoring that truth even when it costs you comfort. Walking away was not revenge, it was peace. Setting boundaries was not punishment, it was love, directed where it was finally needed. Family, I've learned, is not defined by obligation or history, but by who shows up with honesty and care. If any part of this story feels familiar, I want you to know this. You are not weak for staying, and you are not broken for leaving. Survival takes many forms, and all of them require courage. Silence is not loyalty when it erases you. Thank you for being here and for holding space for this story. Being heard matters more than being believed by everyone. It matters that you believe yourself. If you've ever faced a moment where choosing yourself felt terrifying but necessary, I'd love to hear about it. Share your thoughts in the comments if you feel comfortable. Your story may be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. You are not alone, and your voice deserves space, patience, and respect from yourself first. Always now.